Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session is sponsored by Godrej. Thank you so much for tuning in to the very first session of the very first day of the online avatar of Tata Literature Live 2022. So, here's how the 13th edition of your beloved annual Mumbai International Literature Festival is going to work this year. After being online for the last 2 years, for reasons we're all acutely familiar with, this year, your beloved Literature Festival takes on a combined format, both online and, thank God, finally offline. We have 2 days of the online festival, today and tomorrow, streaming across all social media platforms. And then, for those in and around Mumbai, remember you can join us for the physical version of the festival on ground at NCPA on Friday, November 11th, Saturday, November 12th, and Sunday, November 13th, and at the St. Paul's Institute of Communication Education and the bookstore Tidal Waves, both in Bandra, on Saturday and Sunday. You can check out the entire schedule and list of speakers on tatalitlive.in. So, looking forward to seeing you all there so that we can finally turn the page from the last 2 years of loss and longing and usher in light and happiness while keeping those we lost closest to our hearts and in our memories and moving on in the spirit of turning the page. Now, onto our inaugural online session of this festival, The Reveal, The Secret Lives of Thomas Mann. The Guardian describes The Magician, written by Colm Tóibín, as an enormously ambitious book, one in which the intimate and the momentous are exquisitely balanced. Today, let's dig a little deeper about the art of writing fictionalized biographies. Mr. Tóibín has written 2 such books on authors he greatly admires, Henry James and Thomas Mann, and how by combining research and imagination might one be able to bring a famed historical personality, especially another writer, to life in a way a conventional biography can never do. As you must have guessed, our very first author of the session today is the Irish literary polymath Colm Tóibín. He's a novelist, short story writer, essayist, playwright, journalist, critic, and poet. He is the author of more than 10 novels, as well as story collections, a book of poetry, and several books of criticism and plays, all of which have been much lauded and feted. His works have been translated into more than 30 languages, and he has been named as the laureate for Irish fiction for the years 2022 to 2024 by the Arts Council of Ireland, and is currently the Chancellor of Liverpool University. 3 times shortlisted for the Booker Prize, he lives between Dublin and New York since he teaches English and comparative literature at Columbia University. In conversation with him is the author of the international bestseller, The Last Song of Dusk. Siddharth Dhanvant Shanghvi's most recent book is Loss, a collection of essays. He has been the recipient of the Betty Trask Award from the United Kingdom, the Premio Grinzane Cavour from Italy, and was shortlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize. Mr. Shanghvi lives between Mumbai and Goa. Please remember to contribute your questions for the Q&A at the end of this talk by writing into us in the comment boxes of the platform you are viewing us on at any time through the session. And do remember to write in your names as well. So let's flag off the online edition of Tata Literature Live 2022 with The Reveal, The Secret Lives of Thomas Mann, with Colm Tóibín and Siddharth Dhanvant Shanghvi. Over to you, speakers.
Colm, welcome to Tata Lit Live. I'm so delighted that we can have this conversation. I'm such a huge fan of your work. I was told so much about you by a very dear Irish friend, the author Anne Enright, who is an extraordinary talent. She's come here, visited me in Goa, and has waxed lyrical about you. She's a huge fan, as am I. Congratulations on this incredible achievement called The Magician. That's what we're talking about. It's a reconstruction of Thomas Mann's life all the way from Lubeck to Los Angeles. And what a magisterial achievement. I'm just blown away. You know, I spoke to you about this over email, that I think writers make for such extraordinary subjects. I'm sure you've read Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which I thought, which is one of my favorite books. Another friend and a hero of mine, Damon Galgut, wrote a wonderful reconstruction of E.M. Foster's life. And now you've got The Magician. Could you possibly tell all of your many, many readers here in India, what was the starting point or starting image that you had to build on this novel?
I think it was the same as the beginning to Henry James. I wrote a novel called The Master about Henry James, and both of them arose really from that experience I think all of us have when you're about 18 or 19 and you're finding books for yourself, books that are not on courses, books that are not at home, and they're your books. And I think there's an intense relationship with those books. As you grow older, you never really get that experience again with the same level of intensity. So I began, I think the first book I read was The Magic Mountain, which was when I was about 18 or 19. Obviously then Death in Venice, and then on to Buddenbrooks, on to Dr. Faustus, and then other books, short stories, etc. So I became interested. I was fascinated by the work of Thomas Mann. I believed then, I don't believe now, but I believed then, that producing books was a form of authority, was a form of entitlement, was a signal about certainty, stability, seriousness, and that even the way books were produced with writers' names, with writers' photographs, with a whole sense of power and force. And it took me a long time to realize that actually, well, I was reading a biography of someone like Virginia Woolf, how the opposite is the case, how unease, uncertainty, instability, lack of authority, that actually those things tend to matter more than power or force. And so Thomas Mann is a great example of this, because we have his diaries were published 25 years after his death. And so he died in 1955, in around 1980, and then in English a bit later. The sense of him as this sort of shivering, uncertain figure whose erotic life was a secret life, was a homosexual life, but whose political life also was not a stable one. He was not a hero in his own house. He was not a hero in a way in his own body. And so that gap between the man who comes to breakfast and the man who comes to his desk, the mind that suffers, the man that creates, that the gap in the case of Mann is a dramatic one. And also, I became fascinated by various members of his family. Because of his 6 children, really a good number of them were fascinating people. There was a great amount of ambiguity and drama within characters. And there's also the small matter of his wife, that he married very cleverly, and that his wife was a very clever and interesting person. And so all this, you see, would have been fine on its own. But the problem was that this was a deeply interrupted life. This was a life disturbed deeply by history, in a way that the life of Henry James was not. And I mean, just the fact of being born in Germany in 1875 just gave you a certain sort of life, where the First World War would be a huge interruption, and the rise of German inflation, the rise of Hitler, and exile, and then the Second World War and the Holocaust, and then the Cold War. And so history had to be in this book in a way that it didn't in the previous book. So I mean this was a challenge in a certain way. Part of the challenge was that, look, don't ever have 6 children, because 6 children is really, really difficult for a novelist, and there are very, very few novels where the character has 6 children, because you have to keep them all going. It's like juggling. If you have a juggler, you juggle with 4. You say to the juggler, no, you have to juggle with 6. And the juggler says, this is really hard, because 2 balls just keep falling. And so they were the challenges.
Well, we'll get to his children in a little bit. I think that they were such extraordinary subjects unto themselves. But let's start with Mann, and what an extraordinary subject you have in him, a man of contradictions, sexual repression, with wealth and power, and then a sort of fall from grace from America, and a certain milieu that he occupied in California that began to view him as a traitor to his beliefs and conviction. But it's as if you, Colm, had been collecting him over the years, reviewing his books, which I read. You traveled out to see the houses that Mann had lived in across the world. In the process of collecting, gathering, researching, and knowing him better, what was your most poignant learning about him?
Oh, I think what happened to him in the First World War is really fascinating. That he really is a sort of non-political man. He's writing his stories. He's bringing, he's very domestic. He's got his own routines, and he's becomes quite middle-aged when he's quite young. And then 1914 comes. And like a lot of other people, including Rilke, including, on the same people, Henry James, for example, in England, people in 1914 became fired up with patriotism. And that led to them wanting bloodshed, wanting victory, wanting militarism. And Thomas Mann was among the worst, because we can see what he wrote. He wrote a very bad book during this period called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, some of which is very ugly indeed. And even in newspaper articles, he really talked about the sort of things that were fueling the war, the sort of German paranoia about its around, its enemies were all around in Russia and France and England, and that Germany had a sort of culture, whereas the others just had a mere civilization. I mean, these sort of stupid distinctions, culture, civilization, what's that? But so as the war went on, his brother was almost a pacifist, but so it wasn't as though everyone was like him. But what's interesting is how much he changed. Really, by 1920, he's a very different person. And obviously the fall of the Kaiser, the loss of the war, but something else in him just simply, I think, loosened or became calmer. So that's a very, very big change.
So, when you said that there was this distinct change, how can you help us understand what that change was and how he became a very different person and different writer?
I think that to have gone on with that sort of Prussian militarism into the 1920s would really have meant that he would have sort of hitched his star to a force that would really eventually merge with Hitler. And he was never going to do that. In a way, some of it was to do with class. I mean, he was a very rich man. His wife was very rich. He was making a lot of money from his books. And, these were the lowest of the low as far as he was concerned. I mean, the beginnings of the Nazis in the 20s. So it would have been very difficult to have connected with him for him. And he also became ironic. And so he began to view the whole heritage of Germany through an ironic lens, which made its way into The Magic Mountain, which he published in 1924. And so it looks as though conditions in 1914 allowed him to feel like a German patriot. Conditions in 1920 did not.
Well, when I was reading the book, I was also trying to kind of understand the form of the magician. And I remember Truman Capote talking about this in an interview, I think, with the Paris Review many years ago, about how In Cold Blood was a novel, what he called the nonfiction novel. Would you tell us a little about the form of the magician and how you came to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, the last thing I wanted to do was what I ended up doing, because it's what I'm using is chronological time, the sort of system that a biographer will use, which is that you start at the beginning and you move forward more or less chronologically until the end. And with the Henry James book, with The Master, I was able to take 5 years in his life and then flashback and then circle around and then move. With this, I couldn't do that, because as the reader, you want to be in, say, August 1914 without knowing. He doesn't know what's coming in September. And the illusion has to be created that you don't know either. Yeah. And this has to happen in real time. There's no point in coming back, you're wise after the event, because you lose a sort of drama, and you lose a sort of drama that you need And so eventually I realized, why don't I just pick the simplest way of doing this, which is 18 chapters, and each chapter moves forward in time so that you sort of see his life chronologically. This doesn't mean that everything is included. I mean, the real problem becomes then what to leave out, because you have to leave out most things.
Of
For example,
course.
he's a huge cancer operation in the 40s in Chicago. Just don't put that. There's so many things that you just must leave out in order to sort of try and find a core story. And I suppose the core story in my book is the question of family.
Yes, of course, and what a family he had. But, you know, Mann reminds me of so many rich people I've had the misfortune to encounter, and for whom moral parameters are really no constraint. For instance, Mann had a crush on his son. And in so many ways, in today's zamana, I think Mann would probably be cancelled. Do you think so? Do you think that the kind of life that he led and the permissions that he enjoyed in that milieu and at that point of time would really not really pass muster right now?
Well, I think Death in Venice would now be read, if it appeared now, it would be read in an entirely different way than it was read then. What's interesting is that when Death in Venice, which is the story of an elderly German writer coming to Venice and seeing on the beach in the Lido this extraordinarily beautiful boy, which, and we'd learned because Thomas Mann's wife wrote her memoirs, is yes, in 1911, Thomas Mann and his wife and his brother did go to Venice, did stay in that hotel in the Lido, and that he did, in fact, see a beautiful Polish boy on the beach, and that he could not stop looking at him. Now, this is a simple sexual matter, but in his novel, he makes it out to be something to do with ideas of beauty, ideas of death, ideas of the ideal, ideas of decay. So it looks as though it's sort of a massive, it's a sort of, I suppose, dramatization of very symbolic questions. But I think readers now would read it as being, you know, a much simpler book. And I think it would be very difficult to publish that book now. I think it'd be very difficult, in fact, to bring that book into a classroom now. I think students would say, hold on a moment, this is icky. This is good to get this book out of here. But in other ways, you see, he was terribly good at covering his own tracks. I mean, in other words, he was a great man, and you know, he made very scholarly speeches. The diaries are fascinating because he was making these great scholarly speeches, often with audiences of 2,000, listening to his every word. And his diary entry would be that there was a beautiful boy or a beautiful young man in the third row, and he spent his time glancing at him, gazing at him, you know, just making connections with him, and that was really what he remembered about the lecture. So in other words, he knew what to keep public and what to keep private. The exception is Death in Venice. So I think he might become, if he were alive now, be very good at navigating all this new Puritanism.
You know, you write, you cite so many biographies about him to, I guess, recreate him better, to know him better. And I was quite frankly daunted by the scholarship that you engaged with. But at what point of time did he become Mann, the character in your book, and not the celebrated Nobel Laureate that, you know, has been widely known and admired? You know, that kind of wrestling, the inner conversation, the inner appropriation of somebody so that you can express them to what your best capacity of your understanding of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think reading the diaries gives you a sense of him, and that he's a much more sort of tentative, watchful figure. So my idea was that he would be a ghost in the novel. In other words, that instead of being this lively figure at the center of the book who would have plenty to say, who would have jokes, who would, you know, have different sorts of desires, that I would leave him almost frozen. And that it's everyone around him and makes all the noise. He is not a noisy man. He comes into a room silently. At a table, he's often silent. He's watchful. He studies things. So that was the idea, that he wasn't to be in control of his life, in control of his day, in control of his demons, that all of these things were to be separate from him and out of his control, so that at the end of the book, you think, that's very strange. I've been reading about this man, but I don't know if he was really there.
You know, I was actually, when you were talking about that, I was also thinking of, I think there was a conversation that Toni Morrison had, and talking about how she wrote almost all of Beloved, but wasn't able to muster the voice of Sete, the central character in the book. And she said it was really like acting, that unless she didn't really invest herself into it, really drop the guise of being Toni Morrison and entering her, she wasn't being able, because, that book also stems from a real life incident, I think, of a slave woman called Margaret Garner who ran away. So I was very keen to understand how you were able to wrestle, the celebrated man and allow us this internal dialogue, which is what you do so beautifully in this book. Your writing style, Colm, is very polar from the authors who your subject, Henry James, is known for very long, winding, circuitous lyrical sentences. You are extremely cool and terse and laconic. Is this deliberately a counterpoint, or the style that best expresses you?
Oh, I think my style is written out of fear, that I'd be afraid if I tried a longer sentences, I'd use bad grammar, or it would go off into some terrible space. So it's very much sort of an effort to control the world in these little sentences. The big decision with the man thing was what to do about the dialogue. That if you tried, how do you write dialogue from 100 years ago in a different language, in a language that people associate with I don't know, things being long. And the verb being in the wrong place and all that in German, I mean. And so the idea would be to, when his children speak, it is in the 1920s, or a tone from the 1920s. So I went back to find that clipped, witty tone that you find in Hemingway, you find in Fitzgerald, that people are constantly interrupting each other. No one gets to say a long sentence. Everyone's trying to say something witty. And the rule also was that every time Katia comes into the room, Katia being his wife, that she says something interesting or funny or new. And that she never plays the part of the long-suffering housewife. She doesn't do any of that. She's got much more interesting things to say. So that every time you look at a page of dialogue, you see that the line is very, very thin, the line of dialogue, because I'm trying to make it fast. I'm trying to move the book on. I'm trying to go counterintuitively, against this business of Thomas Mann as a sort of stodgy, conservative, Germanic, scholarly, three-piece suited figure into some much more, I suppose, primal or private or guilt-ridden, sort of shame-ridden sort of state.
Colm, I'm very interested in editing. I've worked as a curator for many years, so I believe that when you go into a room, you should know what you can leave out and what you should remove. Michael Ondaatje said that he wrote The English Patient in a year and a half, but then he needed another 3 years to edit it. Could you tell us a little about the editing process for The Magician?
Yeah, the problem you have always with a book like this is how much to put in, how much to leave out. And also, is there a core story? Are you moving towards a core story? And sometimes you're doing that despite yourself, where something else is emerging out of your control that you can only find in the reading of the book. And so I ended up with 205,000 words. Luckily, this was the beginning of the pandemic. And so I had days on end, and what I would do would be just start the book again, print it out and start reading it. And then I had an editor who said, there's too much about all the German composers or figures in California in the 40s. And so at the end of the book, there was a long section about the writing of Thomas Mann's novel, Dr. Faustus. Dr. Faustus was written under strange circumstances. Mann didn't know enough about contemporary music to write the book. Luckily, he had nearby Adorno. And Adorno was the great emerging theorist of modern music. Adorno had an unpublished book. Mann read the unpublished book. He took pages of it verbatim and put them into his own book.
Oh, wow.
Verbatim. And Adorno didn't seem to mind.
Would definitely be cancelled now.
Yes, exactly. Adorno didn't seem to mind at the time. But when Arnold Schoenberg, also living nearby, it was pointed out to him first that the figure of Adrian Leverkühn, who is the protagonist, who is the composer, was based on him. Now, so Schoenberg's eyes were too weak to read the book, which is a mistake, because then people put bits of it on dictaphone. so he could hear the offending passages.
Mm.
And one day, honestly, this is absolutely true, he was in the supermarket in Brentwood, and he met one of the German exiles, and he said to her, "I do not have syphilis." And she said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, Adrian Leverkusen in Dr. Fawcett has syphilis, but he's based on me. People are going to think I have syphilis." And it's an all question of, if you base a character slightly on someone real, then are they entitled to think that everything else, people are going to think everything else is about them? Anyway, big row broke out. Schoenberg hated Adorno. They were always fighting, and they realized that the only person who could have written these pages of Dr. Fawcett was not Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann didn't know enough. It was Adorno. And so a public row broke out. Now, this goes on over pages. This goes on over 2 chapters. And when I'm coming to it, I mean, the editor is saying this is too much. There's something weighed down about this. And so I realized that actually, if I start cutting, I should start cutting big time. I should get all that out. And the problem is, you see, all of this is appearing just before the story of Thomas Mann's son's suicide. And because it's taking up so much space, the suicide looks like an afterthought. Whereas if it's missing, the suicide seems like the culminating terrible thing that happened. That this man got all his children out of Europe during the war. He had an ambiguous relationship. He was cold in certain ways, but he did get them all out. He did pay for them all. He did, create a safe space for them all. And yet by 1949, things are bad enough for Klaus to commit suicide. And so that became the story. That became the line, the emotional line I'm working with. And in order for that to work, a lot of things had to go. But in general, in the book also, a lot of linking passages had to go, explaining sort of context. You needed to know a certain amount, but not too much. And so, cut.
Well, I have a bunch of other questions, but I've been told by Amy Fernandez that I need to wind down. And so I'm going to ask you one question, which is also kind of important to me. And I think that what you do in the book is that you humanize him and that you rescue him, from the patina of being a sort of a political traitor that had afflicted him towards the end of his life. Toni Morrison had said that books are a form of political action, and yet Mann had said that Thomas Mann said that he was not obliged to serve politics in any way. Could you help us understand and humanize his conflicts around this?
Well, I suppose the first conflict is ours. It is that I didn't see Donald Trump coming. I would have told you a while ago that he was never going to be elected. Yeah. Similarly, Mann was in that position with Hitler. He didn't see him coming. And so, I mean, we are still living in the aftermath of those 2 wars. The first one, the Second World War, being there is still the image of a strong man who uses parliamentary politics in order to take power. On taking power, then begins to wind down the various possibilities of liberty. Great numbers of people still support him. And we know him, you know him perhaps better than I do, but that, we just to be polite, we'll pick Viktor Orban as an example, or Bolsonaro. These are the figures who have arisen for the same reason. And also the whole idea of inventing an enemy. That could be that, that, oh, it's the Jews, oh, it's the Syrians, oh, it's the immigrants, oh, it's the and you just go, so we're still living in the shadow of that. But oddly enough, we're still living in the shadow of the First World War, the idea of the paranoid state, of the state believing that its borders are about to be invaded by its enemies. Just the other side, the enemies are there and they have to militarize and attack before someone attacks them. Well, we're still living with that sort of strange paranoia that happens in nations, that is a sort of nationalist thing. So it isn't as though history has moved or anything has improved or anything has got better. And this is really what the novel is about. That in other words, this man who could have easily written his very scholarly novels throughout his life and had his family, suddenly was hurled into politics, into that he had to become an implacable enemy of Hitler because he didn't have a choice. He went into exile because he didn't have a choice. He became a spokesman for the opposition because he didn't have a choice. And we're all still living in the world that that was his. And I wasn't desperately interested in making the novel relevant, because I thought the character and the story should be able to do enough. But unfortunately, it is.
So I'm going to jump into a question that was sent in by Gayatri Ramaswamy, who's a reader of yours. And she said, why do you feel the creative urge to fictionalize the life of other writers?
Oh, I just did it twice. I mean, I've written 10 novels and 2 books of stories. And then out of those 12 books, 2 are on this subject. I don't think I'll do it again. And just these 2 things were on my mind big time. There were, I suppose, also the fact that James and Thomas Mann were both homosexual. I mean, the fact that their secret erotic lives were homosexual lives. The fact that they belong to in the dotted line of gay history, and that they flicker in and out of it. It isn't as though they were, I mean, they weren't Oscar Wilde, they weren't Henri Gide, that they were much more, both of them, reticent, careful figures in, I suppose, a difficult time for homosexual people. And so that also interested me, just creating these 2 gay characters.
Aftab Karimji says that in your book, man does not come through as a good father. Do you think great writers, like other artists, are too self-absorbed to be good parents? Which is a great question, actually.
No, I don't think that. I'm sure there are fathers, there are wonderful fathers who are writers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, throughout the period for which we have a lot of evidence. I think fatherhood in 1900 was a different matter than it became, say, after the Second World War. Where the notion of hugging your children or reading them stories at night, or all that sort of stuff, I just think we've got to be careful about that, not to be anachronistic about it. That fathers and mothers indeed could be very distant, and we see among the rich, for example, the chance of them going on a 2-year tour of various countries they wanted to visit, leaving a child behind in London. This was a common experience. But yeah, we do see Thomas Mann as being a particular, like he wasn't one of those, he didn't seem to fondle his children, put them on his knee and play with them and stuff. He was writing his books.
Yes, you can't expect everybody to bow before the altar of mediocrity and banality. How much?
Hold on now. I think we sort of can. I think we can, actually.
Well, good luck with that. How much of this work is based on research and how much of it is on your imagination? What did you choose to fictionalize and why? That's Mukund Acharya who's asking you that.
I think if I say that Thomas Mann was in Munich in 1940 something, then he was. In other words, that you can trust the fact that this is what happened. With the dates, with the exile, with the number of children, and then within that, a great deal is imagined. In other words, there's no whether I can really research exactly what happened in that room, and I think the reader can see that all the time. Oh yeah, no, this is clearly imagined. And then what I'm trying to do really is create an illusion rather than offer you information, or give you knowledge. I'm giving you illusion. And the illusion is that you're in the room. The illusion is that you're in his mind, that you 2 are engaged or involved in this. And so it's different to a biography in that sense.
Well, I think we have time just for one question. And I remember meeting you in India, and I just wanted to ask you, what was your impression of that trip to Jaipur? Did you enjoy it? And will you come back?
Oh, I'd love to come back. Yeah, I've been in India a few times. That time I went down to Chennai first. You see, the country, if you're Irish, the country is fascinating because you're watching the way in which something has emerged that is both intact from before the British and then has taken on so much from the British. I'm talking about speech. I'm talking about the sort of English that's spoken, which I would associate with the sort of English spoken in Ireland. I'm talking about the way certain buildings or railway tracks or, ways of approaching, for example, democratic elections. That's so much the ferocious way that India approaches its elections can only be mirrored in Ireland. The way in which, and so and there's also the small question of, the sort of 19th century we had and the 19th century you had. And you know that, I mean, especially when you're in Bengal, when you're in Calcutta, you actually do see obvious connections between the way in which Bengali intellectuals and Irish intellectuals set about establishing a sort of fetishization of the landscape and of the native language and of native culture and of poetry and of song. All of that is ours. You think it's yours, it's ours. And so yeah, also the way the British left, and so yeah, it's for that reason alone, it's fascinating. You know, I mean, forget about the food, forget about, you know, the friendliness, just the business of how our history and your history connect.
Yes, and how that they were contaminated, you know, by the same people in so many ways, unites people because of the kind of, you know, transgressions and breaches and pollution that we have lived through. Because I remember actually, you know, when I was a student in London and I was in a train, and that was my first experience of very deep racial prejudice. I remember these two white, straight British men looking at me, making me feel very uncomfortable on the train. And I remember looking across, and there was an Irish woman who began to speak to me with an Irish accent, and she could understand, you know, so in spite of the fact that we were divided by the color of our skin, there was a profound connection, a profound sense of safety and refuge that we could offer in that moment. And that is one of the wonderful things that you do with your books. You provide such great refuge, and you provide such great nourishment to your readers. So I congratulate you and I thank you for writing these books and so many more. And I hope that you come back to Tata Lit Live in India in person so that we can celebrate you. Colm Tóibín, thank you very
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.
Take care.
Ciao.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tóibín and Mr. Shanghvi, for that hugely insightful conversation. And of course, thanks are due to you, our amazing and loyal audience, for joining us today online. Our next session online at 7 p.m. across all social media platforms is South Africa, My Muse, exploring the fractures of a post-apartheid society. We have Damon Galgut in conversation with Salil Tripathi. Remember to check out our website, tatalitlive.in, for the schedule and speakers we have lined up, because we have many more exciting sessions lined up for you, both online today and tomorrow. And for those of you in and around Mumbai, remember to join us for our exciting on-ground festival starting on Friday, November 11th through the weekend to Sunday, November 13th at the NCPA and at St. Paul's Institute and Tidal Waves Bookstore in Bandra, featuring authors and ideologues such as Gitanjali Shri, Damon Galgut, Shashi Tharoor, Kev Patel, Manjari Prabhu, and Mahesh Elkunchwar, among so many other fantastic authors, journalists, poets, and ideologues. Thanks for tuning in to Tata Literature Live 2022 in association with the NCPA, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Titan, powered by Godrej and Kotak. This session was sponsored by Godrej. The festival's social media handle is @Tata Lit Live across all networks. That concludes our very first session for today and for this year. But continue logging on to Tata Literature Live 2022, where you can enjoy turning the page. Happy reading and good evening.